Sarah Martinez wiped the sweat from her forehead as she finished bandaging another wounded soldier. The field hospital at Forward Operating Base Thunder in Afghanistan was always busy, but today felt particularly overwhelming. She had been working as a military nurse for 3 years, and while she loved helping soldiers recover from their injuries, the constant stress was taking its toll. As she walked through the medical tent, Sarah noticed the familiar whispers and snickers from a group of male nurses and medics gathered near the supply closet. Ever since she had arrived at this base 6 months ago, they had made her life difficult. It started with small things, hiding her medical supplies, forgetting to inform her about schedule changes, and making crude jokes when she passed by. The leader of this group was Staff Sergeant Mike Thompson, a tall, muscular man who seemed to enjoy making Sarah's work as challenging as possible. He had 15 years of military experience and used his seniority to intimidate newer personnel, especially female soldiers. Thompson often questioned Sarah's medical decisions in front of patients, undermining her authority and making her doubt herself. "Hey Martinez," Thompson called out as Sarah organized medications. "Did you even check the 4 on bed 7? Looks like you missed it again." His voice carried across the tent, causing several heads to turn in their direction. Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. She had checked every patient thoroughly, including the soldier in bed 7, whose 4 was functioning perfectly. This was Thompson's usual tactic, making false accusations in public to humiliate her. "The 4 is working fine, Sergeant Thompson," Sarah replied quietly, trying to maintain her professionalism. "I checked it 20 minutes ago and documented everything properly." Thompson laughed mockingly. "Sure you did. Maybe you should double-check your work instead of daydreaming about home." His cronies chuckled, enjoying the show they had seen many times before. Sarah clenched her fists but said nothing more. She had learned that arguing with Thompson only made things worse. Instead, she focused on her patients, the brave men and women who depended on her care. They didn't deserve to witness these childish games while they were recovering from serious injuries. Later that evening, Sarah sat alone in her small quarters, writing in her journal. She documented each incident of harassment, hoping that someday she would have enough evidence to file a formal complaint. But she knew the reality. Thompson was popular among the senior staff, and his word would likely carry more weight than hers. The bullying had escalated recently. Last week, Thompson had accidentally bumped into her while she was carrying a tray of medications, causing several vials to shatter on the floor. When their commanding officer asked what happened, Thompson claimed Sarah had been careless and clumsy. The incident was recorded in her file as a minor safety violation. 2 days ago, Sarah discovered that someone had tampered with her medical bag, removing essential supplies she needed for her rounds. When she couldn't find her stethoscope and blood pressure cuff, she was forced to ask other nurses for help, which made her appear unprepared and disorganized. Thompson watched the entire situation with a satisfied smirk on his face. Sarah knew she was being targeted because she was young, female, and relatively new to the base. Thompson seemed to view her presence as a threat to his authority, even though Sarah had no interest in challenging anyone's position. She simply wanted to do her job and help wounded soldiers recover so they could return home safely to their families. The harassment was affecting her performance and mental health. Sarah found herself second-guessing every decision, constantly looking over her shoulder and feeling anxious about coming to work each day. She had considered requesting a transfer to another base, but that would mean admitting defeat and potentially abandoning soldiers who needed her care. What Thompson didn't know was that Sarah came from a military family with a long history of service. Her father had been a decorated Army officer, her grandfather had served in Vietnam, and her brother was currently deployed with special operations somewhere she couldn't even know about. The values of honor, duty, and service had been instilled in her from childhood, which made Thompson's unprofessional behavior even more offensive. Sarah's father had always taught her to stand up for what was right, but he had also warned her about the challenges female soldiers faced in a male-dominated environment. "Some people will test you," he had said before her deployment. "They'll try to break your spirit and make you quit. But if you stay true to your values and do your job with integrity, the right people will notice." As Sarah closed her journal that night, she wondered if the right people would ever notice what was happening to her. She felt alone and isolated, with no allies to support her against Thompson's systematic campaign of harassment. Little did she know that her situation was about to change dramatically in ways she could never imagine. The next morning brought news that would set in motion a series of events that would forever alter the dynamics at Forward Operating Base Thunder. A high-priority medical evacuation was incoming, and all medical personnel were required to be on standby. Sarah prepared herself for another challenging day, unaware that this particular mission would bring someone to the base who would change everything. As she organized her supplies and mentally prepared for the incoming casualties, Sarah tried to push aside the dread she felt about facing another day of Thompson's harassment. She focused instead on her patients and her duty to provide the best medical care possible, regardless of the personal challenges she faced. The sound of helicopters in the distance signaled the beginning of what would become the most important day of Sarah's military career. She took a deep breath, straightened her uniform, and walked toward the landing zone, ready to do her job despite the hostile environment created by those who should have been her colleagues and supporters. The emergency alert echoed throughout Forward Operating Base Thunder at 0800 hours. Sarah grabbed her medical bag and rushed toward the helicopter landing zone along with the other medical personnel. Multiple casualties were incoming from a convoy attack, and every available nurse and medic was needed to handle the situation. As they reached the designated area, Sarah noticed something unusual. Instead of the standard medical evacuation helicopters they typically saw, a sleek Black Hawk was approaching, followed by 2 Apache attack helicopters providing escort. This was clearly a high-priority mission involving personnel of significant importance. Staff Sergeant Thompson pushed past Sarah as they positioned themselves near the landing zone. "Stay out of the way, Martinez," he barked. "This is serious business, not time for rookies to mess things up." His comment drew snickers from his usual supporters, but Sarah ignored them and focused on preparing her equipment. The Black Hawk touched down first, and the medical team immediately went to work. 3 seriously wounded soldiers were quickly transferred from the helicopter to stretchers. Sarah was assigned to assist with the most critically injured patient, a young soldier who had suffered severe shrapnel wounds to his chest and legs. As she worked alongside Dr. Peterson to stabilize the patient, Sarah demonstrated the skills and composure that had made her an excellent nurse despite the constant harassment she endured. Her hands moved quickly and precisely, starting in 4-line while monitoring the soldier's vital signs and communicating clearly with the medical team. Thompson, who was supposed to be helping with another patient, kept glancing over at Sarah's work with obvious annoyance. He had expected her to panic under pressure or make mistakes he could later criticize, but she was performing flawlessly under extremely stressful conditions. "Martinez, you're doing it wrong," Thompson suddenly called out. Even though Sarah's technique was perfect, that 4 placement isn't going to hold during transport. Dr. Peterson looked up from the patient with irritation. "Sergeant Thompson, Nurse Martinez's 4 is exactly where it should be. Please focus on your own patient." The doctor's rebuke was clear and firm, causing Thompson's face to redden with embarrassment. Sarah continued working without acknowledging Thompson's interference. She had learned to tune out his constant criticism and focus on what really mattered, saving lives. The wounded soldier on her stretcher was conscious but in severe pain, and she spoke to him in a calm, reassuring voice while administering pain medication. "You're going to be okay," she told the young man. "We're taking good care of you, and you'll be back home with your family soon." Her gentle but confident manner helped calm the frightened soldier, who gripped her hand tightly as they prepared to move him to the medical facility. As the medical team transported the patients toward the field hospital, Sarah noticed that the Apache helicopters had landed and several figures in flight gear were walking toward their position. This was unusual. Apache crews typically remained with their aircraft during medical evacuations, ready to provide immediate air support if needed. Thompson was still trying to undermine Sarah's work as they entered the medical tent. "I'm telling you, Dr. Peterson, that 4 placement is questionable. Martinez probably learned that technique from some outdated manual." His persistence was becoming disruptive to the entire medical team's efforts. "Sergeant Thompson," Dr. Peterson said sharply, If you have concerns about medical procedures, you can discuss them with me privately after we've stabilized these patients. Right now, I need everyone focused on their assigned tasks. Sarah appreciated Dr. Peterson's support, but she knew Thompson would find ways to retaliate later. He always did. For now, she concentrated on monitoring her patient's condition and preparing him for surgery. The young soldier's breathing had stabilized, and his vital signs were improving thanks to the quick medical intervention. While Sarah worked, she was unaware that one of the Apache pilots had entered the medical facility and was quietly observing the medical team's efforts. The pilot, whose face was hidden behind a flight helmet and visor, watched intently as Sarah expertly managed her patient's care while dealing with Thompson's constant harassment. The mysterious observer noted how professionally Sarah handled both the medical emergency and the unprofessional behavior of her colleague. They watched as she remained calm under pressure, demonstrated excellent clinical skills, and showed genuine compassion for her patient, all while being subjected to undermining comments and criticism. Thompson continued his disruptive behavior, questioning Sarah's every action and making snide remarks about her competence. "Are you sure about that medication dosage, Martinez? Maybe you should double-check with someone who actually knows what they're doing." His comment was loud enough for patients to hear, which was both unprofessional and potentially harmful to morale. Sarah's jaw tightened, but she maintained her composure. She had checked and double-checked every medication, and her dosages were exactly correct according to protocol. Thompson's behavior was becoming more aggressive and public, as if he was trying to prove a point in front of the visiting personnel. The Apache pilot continued watching from the corner of the medical tent, taking note of the dynamics playing out before them. They observed how other medical personnel seemed uncomfortable with Thompson's behavior, but were reluctant to intervene, and how Sarah continued to provide excellent patient care despite the hostile environment. After successfully stabilizing all 3 patients and preparing them for further treatment, the medical team began to clean up their equipment. Sarah was exhausted but satisfied that they had saved 3 lives that day. Her patient, the young soldier with shrapnel wounds, was now stable and ready for transport to a larger medical facility for surgery. As Sarah organized her medical supplies, Thompson approached her with his usual aggressive demeanor. "Next time there's a serious case like this, maybe you should let the experienced personnel handle it. We can't afford mistakes when important people are watching." The comment was Thompson's not-so-subtle way of acknowledging that high-ranking personnel were present, and his way of suggesting that Sarah's presence was somehow inappropriate or inadequate for such situations. It was exactly the type of belittling comment he specialized in making. What Thompson didn't realize was that one of those important people had been watching the entire scene unfold and had formed some very definite opinions about what they had witnessed. The mysterious Apache pilot had seen enough to understand exactly what kind of person Sarah was and what kind of person Thompson was. As the medical team completed their work and began returning to their normal duties, Sarah felt the familiar weight of frustration and isolation that Thompson's harassment always brought. She had performed excellently under pressure, possibly helping to save 3 lives, but all Thompson seemed concerned with was finding ways to criticize and undermine her efforts. The Apache pilot quietly exited the medical facility, leaving Sarah unaware that her professional performance and personal character had been carefully observed and evaluated by someone whose opinion would soon matter more than she could possibly imagine. 3 days after the medical evacuation, life at Forward Operating Base Thunder had returned to its usual routine. Sarah continued her duties in the field hospital, and Thompson continued his campaign of harassment with renewed vigor. The presence of high-ranking visitors seemed to have emboldened him rather than encouraging better behavior. That morning, Thompson had hidden Sarah's medical charts, forcing her to spend extra time locating patient information and making her appear disorganized during morning rounds. When she finally found the charts stuffed behind a supply cabinet, Thompson claimed he had no idea how they had gotten there. "Maybe you should be more careful with important documents, Martinez," he said loudly in front of other staff members. Losing patient charts could be considered a serious breach of protocol. His accusation was particularly unfair since Sarah was known for her meticulous record-keeping and had never actually lost any paperwork. Dr. Peterson had witnessed the incident and privately approached Sarah afterward. "I know what's really happening here," he said quietly. "Thompson's behavior is completely unacceptable. Have you considered filing a formal complaint?" Sarah appreciated the doctor's support, but she knew the challenges involved in making official accusations. "I've been documenting everything," she replied, "but Thompson has friends in high places. I'm not sure anyone would take my word over his." The doctor nodded understandingly. Military hierarchies could be complicated, and junior personnel often faced significant obstacles when reporting misconduct by senior staff. "Well, just know that you have my full support if you decide to move forward," he assured her. Later that afternoon, Sarah was working alone in the medical supply room when Thompson and two of his allies cornered her. The small space felt even more cramped with three large men blocking the exit, and Sarah immediately felt uncomfortable with the situation. "Listen carefully, Martinez," Thompson said, his voice low and threatening. "Some important people visited this base recently, and I don't want them getting the wrong impression about our medical team. That means you need to stay in your lane and stop trying to show off during emergencies." Sarah stood her ground despite feeling intimidated. "I was doing my job, Sergeant Thompson. Taking care of wounded soldiers is exactly what I'm supposed to do." Her voice remained steady, but her heart was racing as she calculated whether she could get past the three men if necessary. "Your job is to follow orders and not make waves," Thompson replied. "And my order is for you to step back and let the qualified personnel handle serious cases. Are we clear?" His tone left no doubt that this was more than a suggestion, it was a threat. Before Sarah could respond, one of Thompson's allies spoke up. "Maybe she doesn't understand how things work around here. Some people need clearer guidance about their place in the chain of command." The comment carried obvious implications that made Sarah's skin crawl. Sarah looked directly at Thompson, refusing to be intimidated despite the overwhelming situation. "I understand the chain of command perfectly, Sergeant. I also understand that my primary duty is to provide medical care to wounded soldiers, which is exactly what I intend to keep doing." Thompson's face darkened with anger. "You're making a mistake, Martinez. This base runs on cooperation and teamwork. People who don't fit in tend to find themselves in very unpleasant situations." The threat was clear, and Sarah realized that Thompson's harassment was escalating to a dangerous level. Just as the situation seemed about to become physical, footsteps could be heard approaching the supply room. Thompson and his allies quickly stepped back, pretending to be casually browsing medical supplies as Dr. Peterson entered the room. "Is everything all right in here?" the doctor asked, sensing the tension in the small space. "I was looking for Sarah to discuss patient assignments for tomorrow." "Everything's fine, Doc," Thompson replied with false casualness. "We were just discussing inventory management with Nurse Martinez." His tone was completely different from the threatening manner he had used moments before. Sarah seized the opportunity to leave. "I have everything I need, Dr. Peterson. We can discuss tomorrow's assignments in your office." She quickly gathered the supplies she had been organizing and followed the doctor out of the room, feeling relief as she escaped the intimidating situation. That evening, Sarah sat in her quarters feeling more isolated and vulnerable than ever before. Thompson's threats were becoming more aggressive, and she was running out of options for dealing with the situation. The harassment was affecting her sleep, her appetite, and her ability to focus on her patients. She pulled out her journal and wrote about the day's events, documenting Thompson's threatening behavior and the intimidating confrontation in the supply room. The written record was growing longer each week, but Sarah wondered if anyone would ever care enough to read it and take action. As she wrote, Sarah thought about her father's advice about standing up for what was right. She had always believed that truth and justice would eventually prevail, but the reality of military life was more complicated than she had expected. Thompson seemed untouchable, protected by his seniority and network of allies. What Sarah didn't know was that her situation had already attracted attention from sources far beyond forward operating base Thunder. The mysterious Apache pilot who had observed the medical emergency had filed a detailed report about what they had witnessed, including Thompson's unprofessional behavior and Sarah's exemplary performance under pressure. That report had made its way up through military channels, eventually reaching individuals with the authority and inclination to investigate further. Sarah's name had been noted, along with Thompson's, and certain people were beginning to ask questions about the command climate at FOB Thunder. The next morning brought news that would set the stage for dramatic changes at the base. Word spread quickly through the facility that a surprise inspection was being conducted by personnel from higher headquarters. These weren't routine administrative checks. This was a comprehensive review of operations, personnel management, and unit effectiveness. Sarah went about her duties normally, unaware that the wheels of military justice were beginning to turn in her favor. She continued to provide excellent patient care despite Thompson's ongoing harassment, maintained her detailed documentation of incidents, and tried to stay focused on the soldiers who depended on her medical expertise. Thompson seemed nervous about the inspection, repeatedly warning his allies to keep things professional while the inspectors were present. He appeared to sense that something was different about this particular review, though he couldn't identify exactly what had triggered the heightened scrutiny. As the inspection team conducted interviews with personnel throughout the base, Sarah wondered if she would be asked to speak with them. She had prepared herself to tell the truth about her experiences if given the opportunity, but she wasn't sure if anyone would be interested in hearing from a relatively junior nurse. Little did she know that her interview with the inspection team had already been specifically requested by individuals who had taken a keen interest in her situation. The same Apache pilot who had witnessed Thompson's behavior was working behind the scenes to ensure that Sarah's story would be heard by the right people. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would expose Thompson's misconduct and vindicate Sarah's professional integrity, but she remained unaware of the powerful forces that were beginning to align in her favor. The inspection team had been at Forward Operating Base Thunder for 2 days, conducting thorough interviews with personnel across all departments. Sarah noticed that Thompson seemed increasingly agitated, constantly checking his appearance and rehearsing responses to questions that hadn't been asked yet. On the second day, Sarah received a message requesting her presence at the command building for an interview with the inspection team. Her heart raced as she walked across the base, wondering what questions they might ask and whether Thompson had already poisoned their perception of her work. The interview room contained 3 officers, a colonel, a major, and a captain who took detailed notes throughout the conversation. Sarah was surprised by how thorough their questions were about the medical facility's operations, personnel relationships, and command climate. Nurse Martinez, the colonel began, "We'd like to hear about your experiences working in the medical facility. How would you describe the working environment and relationships among the medical staff?" Sarah paused, knowing this was her opportunity to tell the truth, but also aware of the potential consequences. "The medical team is dedicated to providing excellent care to wounded soldiers," she began carefully. "However, there have been some challenges with professional relationships and workplace conduct." The major leaned forward with interest. "Can you be more specific about these challenges? We're particularly interested in any incidents that might affect the unit's effectiveness or personnel welfare." Taking a deep breath, Sarah decided to trust in the process and tell her story completely. She described Thompson's systematic harassment, the intimidating confrontation in the supply room, the sabotage of her equipment and medical charts, and the constant undermining of her authority in front of patients and colleagues. The captain looked up from his notes. "Do you have documentation of these incidents?" Sarah nodded and mentioned her detailed journal, which the officers requested to review. They also asked for specific dates, witnesses, and examples of how Thompson's behavior had affected patient care or unit operations. "One more question, Nurse Martinez," the colonel said as the interview concluded. "If you could change one thing about your current assignment to better serve wounded soldiers, what would it be?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "I would want every member of the medical team to focus on our mission of saving lives rather than personal conflicts or power struggles. Wounded soldiers deserve our complete attention and best efforts, not the distraction of workplace harassment." After Sarah left the interview room, the officers discussed what they had learned. The colonel turned to the major. "Her account matches the observations from the Apache pilot exactly. Thompson's behavior is clearly creating a hostile work environment that could compromise patient care." The major nodded. "We also need to consider the broader implications. If Thompson is targeting female personnel this way, it sends a message to other potential victims that reporting misconduct is futile. That undermines good order and discipline throughout the entire base. Meanwhile, Thompson was conducting his own interview with the inspection team. His responses were defensive and evasive when asked about working relationships in the medical facility. When questioned specifically about his interactions with junior personnel, he claimed to maintain high standards and provide necessary guidance to inexperienced soldiers. Nurse Martinez is still learning military medicine, Thompson told the officers. Sometimes new personnel interpret professional feedback as personal criticism. I've always tried to mentor her, but she seems resistant to constructive guidance. The colonel's expression remained neutral, but Thompson's answers only confirmed what they had already learned from multiple sources. The Apache pilot's report, combined with Sarah's detailed account and corroborating statements from other medical personnel, painted a clear picture of systematic harassment and unprofessional conduct. That afternoon, Sarah was working in the medical facility when she noticed unusual activity around the command building. Several vehicles had arrived, and personnel in dress uniforms were moving between buildings with obvious purpose. Something significant was happening, but she couldn't determine what. Thompson seemed particularly nervous, constantly glancing toward the windows and checking his watch. His usual allies were avoiding him, and the atmosphere in the medical facility felt tense and uncertain. Even patients seemed to sense that something important was occurring. Dr. Peterson approached Sarah during a quiet moment. I heard you spoke with the inspection team yesterday. I hope you were able to tell them what's really been happening here. Sarah nodded, but didn't provide details, knowing that military investigations required confidentiality. As the afternoon progressed, word began spreading through the base that major personnel changes were being implemented immediately. Senior leadership was conducting emergency meetings, and several individuals had been summoned for additional interviews with the inspection team. Thompson received a message directing him to report to the commanding officer's office immediately. His face went pale as he read the notification, and Sarah noticed his hands shaking slightly as he prepared to leave the medical facility. For the first time since she had known him, Thompson looked genuinely frightened. While Thompson was meeting with the command staff, Sarah continued her duties caring for patients. She tried not to think about what might be happening in those closed-door meetings, but she couldn't help hoping that justice was finally being served. Unknown to Sarah, the inspection team had completed their investigation and was presenting their findings to the base commander. The evidence against Thompson was overwhelming, including witness statements, documentation of incidents, and expert testimony about the impact of his behavior on unit effectiveness and personnel welfare. The base commander was shocked by what he learned. Thompson had been considered a reliable senior non-commissioned officer, and the extent of his misconduct had somehow escaped official notice. The commander immediately ordered Thompson's removal from the medical facility and initiated formal disciplinary procedures. As the sun began to set over forward operating base Thunder, Sarah finished her shift unaware that her situation was about to change dramatically. The wheels of military justice had turned in her favor, but the most significant moment of vindication was still to come. Tomorrow would bring visitors who would not only validate Sarah's professionalism and dedication, but also demonstrate that her exemplary service had been noticed by individuals whose recognition would change her military career forever. The mysterious Apache pilot who had first observed her excellent work under pressure was preparing to reveal their identity and deliver news that would transform Sarah's perspective on her future in the military. Thompson's reign of harassment was ending, but Sarah's story of professional triumph and personal vindication was just beginning. Sarah arrived at the medical facility the next morning to find an unusually quiet atmosphere. Thompson was nowhere to be seen, and his usual allies were going about their duties with uncharacteristic professionalism. Dr. Peterson approached her with a slight smile that suggested significant news. There have been some important developments overnight, he said quietly. Staff Sergeant Thompson has been reassigned pending a formal investigation into his conduct. He's no longer working in the medical facility. Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her, though she tried to maintain her professional composure. As she began her morning rounds, Sarah noticed that other staff members were treating her differently. The hostile environment that Thompson had created was already beginning to dissipate, replaced by the collaborative atmosphere that should have existed all along. For the first time in months, Sarah felt like she could focus entirely on patient care without constantly looking over her shoulder. Around midday, Sarah received another message requesting her presence at the command building. This time, however, the tone was different, more formal and respectful than the previous interview. She wondered if the investigation required additional information from her. When she arrived at the designated conference room, Sarah was surprised to see not only the base commander but also several officers she didn't recognize, including a colonel wearing aviator wings. The room felt charged with importance, and Sarah sensed that this meeting was about more than just Thompson's misconduct. Nurse Martinez, the base commander, began. "We've completed our investigation into the issues you reported, and I want you to know that appropriate action has been taken. Staff Sergeant Thompson's behavior was completely unacceptable and violated multiple military regulations and standards of conduct." Sarah felt vindicated but remained focused on the professional implications. "Thank you, sir. I hope this will help create a better working environment for everyone in the medical facility." The colonel with aviator wings stepped forward. "Nurse Martinez, I'm Colonel Rebecca Hayes, and I was the Apache pilot who observed your performance during the medical emergency several days ago." Sarah's eyes widened in surprise. She had never considered that the mysterious observer might have been a senior officer, much less a female pilot. Colonel Hayes continued, "I watched you demonstrate exceptional clinical skills, professionalism, and composure while simultaneously dealing with harassment from Staff Sergeant Thompson. Your dedication to patient care under those circumstances was truly impressive." Sarah felt overwhelmed by the revelation. The person whose opinion had helped expose Thompson's misconduct and validate her own professionalism was a successful female officer who had clearly overcome similar challenges in her own military career. "I've reviewed your personnel file, Nurse Martinez," Colonel Hayes said, "and your performance record is outstanding. You've consistently received excellent evaluations, and your patient care statistics are among the best in your unit. That's why I want to discuss an opportunity that might interest you." The colonel explained that she was recruiting personnel for a specialized medical unit that supported elite military operations. The position would require additional training, increased responsibility, and the opportunity to work with some of the military's most advanced medical technologies and procedures. "This assignment would be a significant step forward in your career," Colonel Hayes continued. "You'd be working with a team that values competence, professionalism, and dedication above all else. Gender, rank, and politics don't matter. Only your ability to save lives under the most challenging circumstances." Sarah listened with growing excitement as Colonel Hayes described the opportunity. It represented everything she had hoped to achieve in her military career, the chance to use her skills at the highest level while working with professionals who shared her commitment to excellence. "There's one more thing I want you to understand," Colonel Hayes added. "When I observed you during that medical emergency, I wasn't just evaluating your technical skills. I was watching how you handled adversity, maintained your integrity, and continued to perform your duties despite facing systematic harassment. Those qualities are exactly what we need in our unit." The base commander spoke up again. "Nurse Martinez, I also want to apologize on behalf of this command for the treatment you received. Thompson's behavior should have been identified and stopped much sooner. We've implemented new policies to ensure that no soldier experiences what you went through." As the meeting concluded, Sarah realized that her worst experience had somehow led to her greatest opportunity. The harassment that had nearly driven her to request a transfer had instead brought her to the attention of leaders who recognized and valued her true potential. Colonel Hayes handed Sarah the paperwork for the specialized assignment. "You don't have to decide today, but I hope you'll seriously consider joining our team. Officers like you are exactly why I believe the military's future is bright." Walking back to the medical facility, Sarah felt like she was seeing forward operating Base Thunder with new eyes. The hostile environment that had made her dread coming to work each day was gone, replaced by the collegial atmosphere she had always hoped to find in military service. Dr. Peterson was waiting for her when she returned. "I can tell from your expression that you received good news," he said with a smile. "I hope you know that losing you would be a significant blow to this medical facility. But I also know that you deserve every opportunity to advance your career." That evening, Sarah sat in her quarters reviewing the assignment paperwork and reflecting on everything that had happened. Thompson's harassment had nearly broken her spirit and made her question whether she belonged in the military. Now, she was being offered a position that would allow her to serve at the highest levels of her profession. She thought about her father's advice about staying true to her values and doing her job with integrity. He had been right. The right people had eventually noticed, though the path to recognition had been more difficult than either of them had anticipated. As Sarah began filling out the paperwork to accept Colonel Hayes' offer, she realized that her experience had taught her important lessons about leadership, courage, and perseverance. She had learned that standing up for what was right sometimes required patience and documentation rather than immediate confrontation. More importantly, she had discovered that there were senior leaders in the military who were committed to creating environments where all soldiers could succeed based on their merit and dedication. Colonel Hayes represented the kind of leader Sarah hoped to become someday. Someone who used their position and influence to protect and promote deserving personnel regardless of their background. The next morning, Sarah submitted her acceptance of the specialized assignment and began preparing for the next chapter of her military career. Thompson's campaign of harassment had ended in his disgrace and reassignment, while Sarah's professional integrity had been vindicated by the very people whose respect mattered most. As she walked through the medical facility for one of her last shifts at Forward Operating Base Thunder, Sarah felt grateful for the difficult experiences that had tested her character and ultimately led to this incredible opportunity. She had survived the storm and emerged stronger, more confident, and better prepared for the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead in her military service. The secret Apache had indeed landed and addressed her as ma'am, but more than that, it had brought recognition, justice, and a future filled with unlimited potential for a nurse who had never given up on her commitment to serving others with honor and excellence.